Chapter 1. Beginnings of Architecture, from Protective Structures to Symbolism. The history of architecture begins long before humans had stone, mortar, and elaborate forms. In the beginning, there was the need for protection. Even the early people in the Paleolithic age sought out caves to protect themselves from the cold, animals, and rain. But with sedentariness in the Neolithic age, about 10,000 years ago, something new began. People built consciously designed dwellings for the first time. Protection became design. Necessity gave rise to symbolism. The first architectural evidence is simple huts made of wood, clay, and plant fibers. But soon, more permanent forms developed. Particularly fascinating are the megalithic buildings that were built in Europe in the 4th and 3rd millennium BC. Stone circles such as Stonehenge in England or dolmens and menhirs in France and Spain show that architecture was more than mere protection from the very beginning. These monumental stone settings served cultic purposes. They were places of community, religion, perhaps also astronomy. In the Middle East, too, we find early architectural evidence that goes far beyond the practical. In Göbekli Tepe in today's Turkey, about 11,000 years old, people erected huge T-shaped stone pillars decorated with animal reliefs. This shows that architecture fulfilled symbolic, religious, and social functions even in the earliest cultures. With the development of agriculture and sedentary life, the first settlements emerged. Mud bricks and wood became the most important materials. In Jericho, for example, one of the oldest cities in the world, we find remains of massive walls and towers that were both protection and a demonstration of power. Architecture began to shape communities and make borders visible. The early buildings are not only technical testimonies, but also an expression of a new way of thinking. Man no longer saw himself as just part of nature, but began to consciously shape it. Houses, temples, tombs, they were all expressions of order, of structure, of a will to design space. This is particularly evident in the monumental tomb architecture. Megalithic tombs, kurgans, or temple complexes show that architecture was also associated with the question of death and eternity from the very beginning. Buildings should stay when life passes. Architecture became the memory of mankind. These early testimonies mark the beginning of a long journey in which architecture not only responded to needs but also made worldviews visible. From protective structure to place of worship, from house to monument, this is where the history of an art begins that accompanies people to this day. Chapter 2. Architecture in Mesopotamia, Ziggurats and Palaces. If we look at the history of architecture, the next step takes us to the fertile Mesopotamia between the Euphrates and the Tigris. Mesopotamia. It was here that the first advanced civilizations of mankind emerged, and with them the first real cities. In this region, architecture was not just a question of housing, but an expression of an entire civilization that made order, religion, and power visible in monumental buildings. The materials determined the shape. Stone was rare in Mesopotamia, so mud bricks dried in the sun were mainly used. They were easy to make, but not very durable, so many buildings disappeared over the centuries. Nevertheless, the basic forms have been preserved for us, and they show a clear language. Particularly characteristic of Mesopotamia are the ziggurats, stepped temple towers dedicated to the gods. They consisted of several platforms on top of each other, which became smaller towards the top. The most famous is the ziggurat of Yor, built around 2100 BC for the moon god Nana. With its huge steps, it rose like an artificial mountain into the plain. The ascent to the temple at the top was not only an architectural path, but a symbolic one, from the earth up to heaven, from the human world to the gods. The cities of Mesopotamia were surrounded by walls that offered security and demarcation. Within these walls stood palaces, temples, and dwellings. The streets often did not follow a fixed plan, but grew organically over time. Nevertheless, temples and palaces formed the center that reflected the social order. The palaces were not only the residences of the rulers, but also centers of administration, trade, and representation. Particularly impressive is the Palace of Assyria or that of Nineveh, where reliefs depict hunting scenes and conquests. Here, architecture was combined with art. Walls were decorated with colored bricks depicting rulers as victors and chosen ones of the gods. A highlight of Mesopotamian architecture was the city of Babylon. It flourished under King Nebuchadnezzar II, 6th century BC. The famous Ishtar Gate, covered with glazed blue bricks and depictions of lions, dragons, and bulls, was a triumph of architecture, and at the same time a symbol of royal power. The processional route leading to the gate made it clear as soon as you entered the city that you were entering a place of divine and royal order. The legend of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the world, is also a testament to this architecture. Whether they really existed is unclear, but the idea of terraced gardens covered with plants shows a longing to combine nature and architecture. The Mesopotamian architecture was therefore far more than functional. It was a means of embodying the power of kings and the closeness of the gods. Temple towers, palaces, and city gates made it clear that it was not just a man who ruled here, but a God-ordained order. At the same time, the architecture of Mesopotamia was an expression of innovation. With mud bricks, vaults, and colored glazes, people created buildings that appeared monumental despite the ephemeral material. They laid the foundation for many traditions of architecture that have been further developed in other cultures. In this way, Mesopotamia shows us that architecture was more than architecture early on. It was a symbol and a sign, a monument that combined power and religion. Chapter 3. Architecture in Ancient Egypt, Monuments for Eternity. Hardly any other era of architecture is as closely associated with the idea of eternity as ancient Egypt. For thousands of years, the people of the Nile built buildings that served not only as tombs or temples, but as symbols of a world order in which the pharaohs ruled as mediators between gods and humans. The materials played a decisive role. While mud bricks dominated in Mesopotamia, there was plenty of stone available in Egypt: sandstone, limestone, and granite. This material gave the buildings durability, and this was exactly what the Egyptian idea was. Architecture should not be transient, but secure the way to the afterlife. The most famous are the pyramids. As early as the 3rd millennium BC, the enormous tombs of the pharaohs were built, which were intended as monumental steps into eternity. The Step Pyramid of Saqqara, built under King Djoser by master builder Imhotep, is considered the first great stone structure of mankind. It marks the transition from simple mastabas to the monumental pyramids. The highlights can be found in Giza, where the great pyramids of Cheops, Khephren, and Mykerinos were built. In particular, the Pyramid of Cheops, originally almost 150 meters high, testifies to an architectural and organizational masterpiece. Millions of stone blocks were precisely placed on top of each other, so that the pyramid is still one of the most impressive structures in the world today. The Sphinx watches over her, half lion, half man, a guardian of eternity. But the pyramids are only one part of Egyptian architecture. Equally important were the temples dedicated to the gods. Unlike the pyramids, which were intended for the afterlife, the temples were places of living religion. In Karnak and Luxor, we find huge temples with huge columned halls, obelisks, and processional paths. The hypostyle hall of Karnak, with its over 100 huge columns, is a masterpiece of sacred architecture that transports the visitor to another world. Characteristic of the Egyptian temples are the pylons, monumental entrance gates flanked by towers that mark the transition from the secular to the sacred sphere. Behind it followed open courtyards, porticos, and finally the Blessed Sacrament, which was only accessible to the priests. Architecture structured the path from light to darkness, from the world to the divine. The funerary temples in the Valley of the Kings and Queens also show the importance of architecture. The terrace temple of Queen Hatshepsut in Deir el-Bahari is particularly famous. Nestled in the rocky landscape, with its clear terraces and colonnades, it combines nature and architecture in an impressive way. In addition to the monumental buildings, there was also everyday architecture, which has been less preserved to us. Houses made of mud bricks, palaces with painted walls and courtyards gave people space to live. But only the buildings for the gods and the dead were built of stone, and only they survived time. Egyptian architecture follows a clear principle. It is monumental, symmetrical, orderly. Everything has its place, every form its meaning. Architecture here was not only functional, but a reflection of the cosmic order embodied by Ma'at, the principle of harmony and justice. To this day, the buildings on the Nile exert a tremendous fascination. They are testimonies of a culture that understood death not as an end, but as a transition, and which created an image of eternity in its architecture. Chapter 4. Architecture in Ancient Greece, Harmony and Proportion. With ancient Greece, architecture reached a new level. Here, an understanding of architecture emerged that was not only functional or religious, but was based on harmony, measure, and beauty. The Greeks searched for the ideal relationship in their architecture, for an order that brought man into harmony with the cosmos. The central building of the Greek world was the temple. It was not primarily a meeting place for believers, but the dwelling place of the god to whom it was consecrated. Inside, in the naos, stood the cult image, while the believers usually performed their rituals outdoors. The temple was thus more a symbol than a function, a visible sign of the presence of the divine in the polis. The Greeks developed three basic orders of columns that still shape architecture today: the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian order. Each had its own proportions and characters. The Doric order, strict and powerful, embodies clarity and simplicity. The Ionic order looks more elegant, with its volute capitals. Finally, the Corinthian order is richly decorated, with acanthus leaves as ornament. These orders were not just decoration, but the expression of a well-thought-out system of proportion and balance. The most famous Greek temple is the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens. It was built in the 5th century BC under Pericles and attributed to Phidias, Callicrates, and Ectinos. The Parthenon combines Doric austerity with subtle corrections. The columns are slightly inclined inwards. The stylobate, the platform on which they stand, is slightly arched. These seemingly small details prevent optical distortion and create a harmony that is still admired today. In addition to temples, the Greeks also built theaters that served as places of community. The theater of Epidaurus is a masterpiece of acoustics and interior design. Even in the top rows, words from the stage are clearly understandable. Stadiums and agora facilities also shape the polis, the city as a political and social unit. Greek architecture has always combined function with aesthetics. The agora was a marketplace, a place of justice, and a political center at the same time, and its buildings embodied the values of the polis. Architecture was a mirror of social life here. Another characteristic is the close connection to philosophy. Pythagoras already spoke of the harmony of numbers. Plato and Aristotle discussed moderation, beauty, and order. For the Greeks, architecture was not just architecture, but an expression of a worldview in which the beautiful and the good belong together. The impact of Greek architecture extends far beyond its time. The Romans adopted and further developed their forms. The Renaissance took them up again. And even in modern times, we find orders of columns as a symbol of order and democracy. Greek architecture shows us that building is not only protection or representation, but also philosophy. Their temples, theaters, and stadiums embodied the ideal of a society that understood people as the measure of all things, in harmony and proportion. Chapter 5. Architecture in Ancient Rome, Technology, Power, and Monumentality. If the Greeks coined the ideal of harmony and beauty in architecture, the Romans gave architecture a new dimension: technology, functionality, and monumentality. Roman architecture was less philosophical than Greek, but more practical, innovative, and designed to demonstrate power. With roads, bridges, aqueducts, thermal baths, and massive buildings, the Romans created a legacy that was to shape Europe for centuries. A decisive advance was the consistent use of concrete, opus caementicium. This material allowed shapes that were difficult to realize with ashlar stones and wood. Arches, vaults, and domes became the basis of Roman architecture. Where the Greeks worked with columns and architraves, the Romans set arches and arcades, more flexible, more load-bearing, and more monumental. A prime example of this technology are the aqueducts, which carried water over many kilometers into the cities. The Pont du Gard in the south of France impressively shows the elegance and functionality of Roman engineering. Bridges and streets with their stone pavements have also been preserved to this day, testimonies to an architecture that aimed at durability and practicality. The public buildings of the Romans were places of social life. Especially the thermobaths, gigantic bathing facilities, combined hygiene, relaxation, and culture. The baths of Caracalla in Rome offered not only baths, but also gardens, libraries, and sports fields. Here, architecture was a social medium that staged community and power at the same time. The amphitheater is another Roman invention that had a spectacular effect. The most famous example is the Colosseum in Rome. With space for over 50,000 spectators, it was an arena for games, gladiator fights, and public spectacles. Its system of arches, arcades, and underground passages shows how much the Romans knew how to combine function and technology. The temple architecture also continued to develop. Although the Romans borrowed much from the Greeks, their temples were often built on high podiums and oriented towards the front. The Pantheon in Rome is a masterpiece. With its huge dome and open oculus through which light enters the room, it is a building that still inspires amazement today. The dome, almost 44 meters in diameter, was a technical marvel and, at the same time, a symbol of the connection between heaven and earth. The triumphal arches were an expression of military power. They did not serve practical purposes, but glorified victories and rulers. The Arch of Titus or the Arch of Constantine in Rome are stone monuments of political propaganda that inscribed history in architecture. Urban planning was also a Roman achievement. Cities were laid out according to a rectangular grid, with a forum, basilica, thermobaths, and amphitheater. The forum was the heart and center of administration, trade, and religion. Architecture here was clearly structured and reflected the order of the empire. Roman architecture was not only monumental, but also ubiquitous. Residential buildings, so-called insula, offered space for the general population, while the villas of the rich were decorated with gardens, porticos, and frescoes. Architecture was a part of everyday life, not only for elites, but for all classes. Rome's heritage is still felt today. From bridges and aqueducts to basilicas and domes, many principles of Roman architecture were taken up again in the Renaissance, Baroque, and modern times. Rome has shown that architecture can be not only art, but also technology, organization, and symbol of power. Chapter 6. Architecture of the Early Christians and Byzantines, Sacred Spaces and New Forms. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity, a new phase in architectural history began. What had previously been aimed at monumentality, power, and secular representation in Rome was transformed in Christianity into an architecture of faith that produced new forms. Early Christian and Byzantine architecture was a field of experimentation in which tradition and innovation mixed to create sacred spaces for a new religion. The early Christians encountered a paradoxical situation. During their persecution in the first centuries, they gathered secretly in private houses or catacombs. These places were simple, functional, and offered little room for artistic development. But with the recognition of Christianity by Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, everything changed. Now representative buildings were needed that gave expression to the growing community. The basilica became the basic form of Christian architecture. Originally a Roman building for markets and court hearings, it has now been converted into a church. The elongated hall with central nave, side aisles, and apse offered space for large congregations and a clear orientation towards the altar. A famous example is the old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which Constantine had built. With its central nave, transept, and atrium, it became a model for countless church buildings. At the same time, in the East, in Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, a distinct architectural tradition developed. Here, the central design with domes and round floor plans was of particular importance. The culmination of this development is the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, built in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian. With its huge dome, which seems to float weightlessly above the room, it is still considered a masterpiece today. Light penetrates through numerous windows so that the dome looks as if it has been suspended, a symbol of heaven on earth. Byzantine architecture combined Roman construction technology with a spiritual symbolism that was supposed to transport the visitor to another world. Golden mosaics, richly decorated icons, and magnificent decorations transformed the room into an image of the divine. Architecture and art entered into a unity here that wanted to make the invisible visible. While the basilica shape dominated in the West, the domed church dominated the image in the East. This separation was to shape the architecture of Europe for centuries. But in both cases, the same idea was at the center. The church was not just a building, but a sacred space, a visible expression of faith and community. The symbolism of the architecture also changed. The orientation to the east, to the rising sun, symbolized the resurrection of Christ. The structure of the central nave, transept, and choir became the representation of the cross. Architecture was not neutral here, but permeated with meaning. Early Christian and Byzantine architecture is thus a decisive step in the history of construction. It shows how a new religion expresses itself in architecture, by adopting old forms, reinterpreting them, and finally creating new ones. The Roman basilica becomes the church, the Pantheon becomes the Hagia Sophia. It is the birth of an architecture that was to shape sacred space for centuries, and which still unfolds its effect today when entering a basilica or a Byzantine domed church. Chapter 7. Romanesque Architecture, Fortress of Faith. In Europe from the 10th to 12th centuries, after the turmoil of the migration of peoples and the disintegration of ancient structures, an architecture emerged that encapsulated stability, protection, and faith in stone, the Romanesque. The name already hints at its roots. It took up Roman architectural forms such as the round arch, but developed an independent style from them that corresponded entirely to the medieval worldview. At first glance, the Romanesque architecture looks massive, heavy, and monumental. Walls of great thickness, small windows, and massive towers determined its appearance. They are more like fortresses than light-flooded rooms. This was no coincidence, because Romanesque was created in a time marked by uncertainty, wars, and power struggles. Churches and monasteries were not only places of worship, but also places of protection and defense. The most important building of the era was the church. Characteristic are the round arch, the barrow vault, and the clear structure of the floor plan into nave, transept, and choir. The Romanesque church building was an expression of a faith that sought security and stability. When you enter a Romanesque church, you feel the heaviness of the room, the austerity and the power that amazes the visitor and at the same time demands humility. An outstanding example is Spire Cathedral, one of the largest Romanesque churches in Europe. Its massive nave with its mighty arcades and towers overlooking the sky make it a symbol of imperial power. The churches of Cluny in France, the largest monastery of the Middle Ages, also show the dimensions that the Romanesque could reach. In addition to the cathedrals, monasteries in particular shaped Romanesque architecture. Benedictines and Cistercians created complexes that encompassed not only sacred spaces but entire living environments. Cloisters, recfectories, and dormitories were grouped around the church and formed a center of the spiritual and secular order. Architecture here became an expression of a spiritual discipline that shaped his whole life. We also find clear traces in regional architecture. In France, the heavy churches of Normandy. In Italy, the colorful facades of Pisa and Florence. In Germany, the cathedrals of Mainz and Worms. Everywhere the same style manifested itself, which took up local peculiarities but spoke a common language, the language of faith in stone. However, Romanesque was not only a style, but also a message. Their shapes are simple but powerful, their rooms dark but sublime. Their towers rise like fingers to the sky. It is the architecture of a world that sought the heavenly in the earthly, that saw the order of the cosmos in the order of the building. Even though the Romanesque was later replaced by the Gothic with its light cathedrals, it remains unique in its effect. It is the architecture of faith in a time that needed security and protection, an architecture that still leaves visitors in awe today. Chapter 8. Gothic Architecture. Cathedrals of Light and Stone. The 12th century marked the beginning of an era that gave rise to a completely new ideal in architecture, the Gothic. Where the Romanesque style still sought security and protection in massive walls and narrow windows, an architecture now arose that strove for height, light, and transcendence. To this day, the Gothic cathedrals are symbols of an art that wanted to bring heaven closer to people. Stone prayers that pointed far beyond the earthly with their towers and vaults. The Gothic style originated in France, more precisely in Ile-de-France, around 1140, when Abbot Suger led the construction of the new Abbey Church of St. Denis. His goal was to create a place of worship that was not only solid and safe, but also flooded with light and radiant. With the use of pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, a revolution in architecture was achieved. The loads of the walls could be dissipated outwards, so that the walls could be broken through and filled with large windows. The result was cathedrals that no longer looked like fortresses, but like stone marvels of light. The stained glass windows, often colorful and artistically designed, made the interior shine. The light itself was understood as a divine presence that transformed space through architecture. A masterpiece of early Gothic architecture is the Cathedral of Chartres, whose stained glass windows are still overwhelming in their colorfulness today. Reims Cathedral, the coronation church of the French kings, and Amiens Cathedral also bear witness to the monumentality and spiritual power of Gothic architecture. Particularly impressive is the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, with its famous towers, gargoyles, and rose window. It combines all the elements of the Gothic style: the ascent to the heights, the abundance of light, the unity of architecture and sculpture. The facade is both a sermon and an ornament, with scenes from the Bible telling stories to the faithful in stone. The Gothic style spread rapidly throughout Europe. In Germany, huge buildings were built, such as Cologne Cathedral, which was not completed until the 19th century, but was already begun in the 13th century and seems to touch the sky in its size and height. In England, we find a slightly different expression called the perpendicular style, with long, straight lines, like in Salisbury Cathedral. In Spain, on the other hand, the Gothic style developed with even richer ornaments, for example in the Cathedral of Burgos. Another characteristic of the Gothic period are the sculptures and decorations. Portals, capitals, gargoyles, everything was used to fill the space with symbols, figures, and stories. The cathedral was not only a place of prayer, but also a Bible in stone for a largely illiterate audience. However, the Gothic is more than an architectural style. It is an expression of a mental attitude. While the Romanesque style conveyed the feeling of solidity, the Gothic created spaces that lifted the heart. Height and light became metaphors for the divine. The cathedral was an image of the heavenly Jerusalem, an attempt to make heaven visible on earth. To this day, Gothic buildings fascinate with their audacity. The constructions are technically ingenious, but also deeply symbolic. They show that architecture is not only function and material, but also an expression of the human striving for transcendence. Chapter 9. Renaissance Architecture, Rebirth of Antiquity. With the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance around 1400 in Italy, architecture changed fundamentally. After the sky-striving cathedrals of the Gothic period, the master builders and artists now turned back to antiquity. They were looking for measure, proportion, and harmony, for an architecture that placed people at the center and grasped the world in rational order. The Renaissance was more than an architectural style. It was an expression of a new mindset, humanism. The human being was regarded as the measure of all things, and so architecture was also based on clear, comprehensible rules. Antiquity was considered a model. Roman temples, triumphal arches, and domes inspired the new buildings. An outstanding beginning of this era was the dome of the Florentine Cathedral, designed by Filippo Brunelleschi. With a diameter of over 40 meters, it was a technical marvel of its time. Brunelleschi solved the problem of how such a huge dome could be erected without scaffolding through a sophisticated system of double shells and wooden auxiliary structures. The dome became a symbol of the new era, technical innovation combined with an ancient design language. The change is also evident in the church buildings of the Renaissance. Instead of the vertical Gothic, a horizontal order was created, with clear lines and central floor plans. Churches such as San Lorenzo or the Pazzi Chapel in Florence show an architecture of calm, clarity, and mathematical proportion. Another milestone was the new construction of St. Peter's in Rome, which was built in the 16th century under Bramante, Michelangelo, and later Carlo Maderno. Bramante's original design envisioned a central building with a huge dome inspired by the Pantheon. Michelangelo adopted this idea and created a masterpiece with his dome that still towers over Rome today. The palaces of the Renaissance also reflect the new attitude. In Florence, the city palaces of the Medici, Pitti, and Strozzi were built, massive but orderly buildings with clearly structured facades. The architecture of power was no longer manifested in towers reaching for the heavens, but in the mastery of measure and symmetry. The villa culture also flourished. The villas of Andrea Palladio in Veneto are particularly famous. His buildings, such as the Villa Rotonda, are characterized by perfect symmetry, clear proportions, and the use of ancient temple fronts. Palladio's influence extended far beyond Italy. As late as the 18th century, his design served as a model for manor houses in England and America. Another field was urban planning. Renaissance architects began to design cities according to rational principles, with symmetrical squares, straight streets, and clear axes. Man was to move in an orderly environment that combined reason and beauty. Renaissance architecture is thus a deliberate return to antiquity, but at the same time a departure into modernity. It combines the heritage of Rome with the new self-confidence of man. Their buildings radiate clarity, tranquility, and harmony, qualities that are still considered ideal today. While the Gothic looked to the sky, the Renaissance focused on the world and people. It is the rebirth of measure, order, and beauty, and a foundation for the architecture of the centuries to come. Chapter 10. Baroque Architecture, Splendor, Power, and Staging. The harmony and clarity of the Renaissance was followed in the 17th and 18th centuries by an era that put architecture in a new light, the Baroque. If the Renaissance had placed man and reason at the center, the Baroque turned art into a stage. Architecture now became a means of staging, the embodiment of power, splendor, and spiritual emotion. The Baroque emerged in Italy, especially in Rome, as a response to the challenges of the Counter-Reformation. The Catholic Church wanted to win the faithful not only through words, but through experiences. Churches should not be sober halls, but emotional spaces that trigger amazement, emotion, and devotion. Architecture, painting, and sculpture merged into a total work of art. A master of this style was Gian Lorenzo Bernini. His work, St. Peter's Square in Rome, shows the Baroque idea in perfection. Two huge colonnades embrace visitors like the arms of the church. The design of the interior of St. Peter's, with the magnificent canopy above the papal altar, also makes it clear how much architecture here becomes a religious staging. Baroque churches are characterized by moving floor plans, curved facades, and rich decorations. Light was deliberately used to create drama. Sometimes it streamed through hidden windows like a divine apparition. Sometimes it precisely illuminated altars and sculptures. But the Baroque was not only ecclesiastical, but also secular. Kings and princes used it to make their power visible. The most famous example is the Palace of Versailles near Paris. Under Louis XIV, the Sun King, it became a symbol of absolutist rule. The endless facades, the magnificent halls such as the Gallery of Mirrors, the geometrically designed gardens, all this was not just luxury, but a conscious sign of the order that the king exercised over his empire. In Germany, magnificent residences such as the Würzburg residence or Charlottenburg Palace in Berlin were built under Baroque influence. Monasteries such as Odoburen or Melk were also designed in Baroque abundance, with lavish frescoes, stucco work, and magnificent altars. Characteristic of the Baroque is theatrality. Architecture should not only function, but move. Stairs, domes, squares, and gardens were designed in such a way that they formed a dramaturgy. The visitor should be amazed, overwhelmed, feel part of a production. In the 18th century, the Baroque period evolved into Rococo, a lighter, more playful variant that relied less on monumentality than on elegance and decor. But the core remained the same: architecture as an expression of power, splendor, and emotion. The Baroque is thus an architecture of pathos. He does not want to teach people soberly, but to carry them along. His buildings are not only spaces, but stages for faith, for rule, for the power of beauty. Even today, Baroque buildings impress with their power and beauty. They show us that architecture does not only mean protection or order, but can also be an art of seduction, staging, and amazement. Chapter 11. Rococo Architecture, Lightness and Elegance. If the Baroque was the great stage of power and pathos, in the 18th century, Rococo appeared, an architecture that transformed all this into a lighter, more playful, and more elegant direction. While the Baroque overwhelmed the visitor with force and monumentality, the Rococo sought to enchant him, with delicacy, ornament, and an atmosphere that invited more enjoyment than amazement. The term Rococo is derived from rocaille, the French word for shellwork, a typical ornament of this period. This alone reflects the character of the style: organic, curved shapes that are reminiscent of natural motifs such as shells, flowers, or tendrils. Everything seemed moving, playful, decorative. Rococo architecture first originated in France, but then quickly spread to Germany, Austria, and all over Europe. It was closely linked to courtly life, salons, pleasures, and the desire for lightness in a time marked by luxury and social elegance. Especially in interior design, the Rococo reached its perfection. Magnificent halls were furnished with stucco, mirrors, and gilded ornaments. The rooms seemed brighter, more delicate, more intimate than the austere halls of the Baroque. Colors such as pastel blue, pink, and white dominated. Mirrors multiplied the light streaming through large windows, creating the impression of infinite expanses. A masterpiece of the Rococo period is Sanssouci Palace in Potsdam, which Frederick the Great had built as a place of retreat. Unlike Versailles, which set absolutism in stone, Sanssouci was intended to be a place of enjoyment, music, and conversation, light, elegant, and on a human scale. In southern Germany, too, numerous churches were built in the Rococo style, which stand out for their brightness and playful ornamentation. The Wieskirche in Bavaria, built by the Zimmermann brothers, is a prime example. Bright, flooded with light, with richly decorated stucco and frescoes that transform the room into a heavenly vision. The Rococo was not monumental, but intimate. It was aimed less at large crowds than at smaller societies, at a courtly culture that loved the spirit of entertainment, play, and elegance. Rooms were no longer designed as powerful stages, but as artistic backdrops for parties, music, and conversation. At the same time, Rococo was an art of exaggeration. No ornament seemed too much, no detail too small to be decorated. Furniture, mirror frames, clocks, everything was part of a total work of art. But already towards the end of the 18th century, the Rococo was criticized by many as overloaded and superficial. With the emerging Enlightenment and the political upheavals, especially the French Revolution, people were once again looking for severity, clarity, and seriousness. This marked the end of the cheerful world of Rococo, and classicism took its place. Nevertheless, the Rococo remains a unique chapter in architectural history. It shows that architecture must not only be power and monument, but can also express lightness, play, and joy. His elegance enchants to this day, be it in the filigree stucco work, the bright church interiors, or the delicate colors of his palaces. Chapter 12. Architecture of Classicism. Return to Antiquity and Reason. The late 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century marked the dawn of a new era that marked a deliberate departure from the playful Rococo style of architecture, Classicism. While the Rococo celebrated lightness, ornamentation, and elegance, Classicism sought austerity, clarity, and moral seriousness. The architects once again turned to antiquity, not as a decorative quotation, but as a model of a timeless, rational order. The trigger for this development was, among other things, the archaeological discoveries in Pompeii and Herculaneum, which renewed the view of the ancient world. Suddenly, Roman houses, temples, and streets could be seen with your own eyes, and these finds inspired artists and architects all over Europe. Classicism was closely linked to the ideas of the Enlightenment. He understood architecture not only as an aesthetic, but also as a moral matter. Strict forms, clear proportions, renunciation of excessive jewelry, all this was considered an expression of reason and virtue. People were to live in orderly, clearly structured spaces that embodied measure and harmony. Classicism was particularly pronounced in public architecture. In France, the Church of La Madeleine in Paris was built like a Roman temple. In Germany, the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin as a triumphal arch based on the ancient model. In Russia, too, for example in St. Petersburg, Classicism shaped the cityscape with its long, orderly facades and monumental squares. In the young United States of America, Classicism became the political style par excellence. The Capitol in Washington or the White House are examples of how the ancient design language was interpreted as a symbol of democracy and republican values. Ancient temples served as a model for the temples of democracy. Classicism was also used in residential architecture and urban planning. Orderly squares, symmetrical streets, and clear facades replaced the playfulness of the Rococo. Instead of ornamentation, simplicity and dignity dominated. But Classicism was not only a recourse, but also a vision. It was supposed to represent a society that strove for reason, order, and progress. In its strictly structured forms, one saw a reflection of the moral renewal promised by the Enlightenment. At the same time, Classicism also became the architecture of power in the hands of the rulers. Napoleon had triumphal arches and monuments erected in Paris to celebrate his victories. In Prussia, Frederick William II used Classicism to equip the Prussian capital with monumental buildings that demonstrated order and strength. Classicism is thus an architecture of seriousness, clarity, austerity. He does not want to enchant like the Rococo, but to convince. He sees antiquity not only as beauty, but also as moral role models. In the course of the 19th century, classicism was replaced by new trends, but its effect remained. To this day, classicist buildings characterize many capitals of the world and convey the image of an architecture that embodies order, dignity, and permanence. Chapter 13: Architecture of Romanticism and Historicism, Longing and Stylistic Diversity. In the 19th century, Europe was once again in a state of upheaval. Industrialization, social change, and a look into the past shaped the cultural climate. In architecture, this led to a return to historical styles and at the same time to new forms that expressed emotion, longing, and national pride. The era of Romanticism and Historicism is therefore characterized by diversity, nostalgia, and symbolic expressiveness. Romanticism brought the longing for the Middle Ages and nature into architecture. Gothic forms, towers, pointed arches, and filigree decorations experienced a renaissance, not only in churches, but also in castles and palaces. The buildings often looked like something out of a fairy tale. They were supposed to amaze, tell stories, and make the connection between history and the present visible. An outstanding example is Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, built by King Ludwig II. It is not a functional residence, but a total work of art that combines fantasy, history, and romance. Towers, battlements, and interiors are reminiscent of medieval castles, but are built in a modern way and reflect the dream of the builder. The architecture here becomes a projection of longing, an idealized past that can be experienced in the present. At the same time, historicism developed, which consciously drew on historical styles but systematically combined them in new contexts. Classicist, Gothic, Romanesque, and Baroque elements were combined to create monumental public buildings. Historicism was an expression of a time that reflected on its past and at the same time legitimized itself through the new political and economic realities. A typical example is the Palais Garnier in Paris, the Paris Opera. Its magnificent exterior with columns, statues, domes, and ornaments combines Baroque splendor with classicist austerity. The interior, staircase, and auditorium are monumental through and through, a total work of art that combines wealth, culture, and power. In Germany, too, historicism shaped the cities. Town halls, railway stations, and university buildings took up historical styles and conveyed stability, authority, and identity through their forms. The New Schule in Vienna and the university buildings in Berlin and Munich are testimonies to an architecture that deliberately adapted historical forms in order to do justice to modern functions. Another characteristic of this era is the combination of technology and tradition. Iron, steel, and glass were integrated into the architecture, often invisibly so as not to disturb the historical impression. The result was an architecture that was both functional and symbolic. Romanticism and historicism show that architecture must not only be rational, functional, or monumental, but can also convey emotions, memories, and identity. The buildings became bearers of longing, national identity, and cultural memory. This epoch is a transition to modernity. While looking back on history, it is also laying the foundation for new technical possibilities and creative freedom. The mixture of nostalgia, symbolism, and innovative technology makes the architecture of Romanticism and Historicism fascinating to this day. Chapter 14: Architecture of the Industrial Age: Iron, Steel, and Glass. Industrialization in the 19th century marked the beginning of a new era of architecture that focused on technology, function, and mass production. The enormous upheavals in society, the economy, and transport led to completely new construction tasks. Cities grew rapidly. Factories, train stations, and bridges had to be built. And the traditional building materials of stone and wood were no longer sufficient. The architecture of the industrial age was therefore characterized by iron, steel, and glass, by new structures and industrial aesthetics. One of the most important innovations was iron as a load-bearing building material. It made it possible to build buildings in previously unimagined dimensions and shapes. Bridges such as the Eiffel Bridge in Bordeaux or the Brooklyn Bridge in New York demonstrated the possibilities of the new technology. Iron was light, stable, and flexible, opening up a new scope for architects that traditional materials could not offer. At the same time, glass revolutionized architecture. With large-scale glazing, halls and markets could be roofed over that would have been unthinkable before. One example is the Crystal Palace in London, built in 1851 for the Great Exhibition. The transparent hall, consisting of glass and cast iron, symbolized progress, industry, and modernity. Light, space, and technical precision merged here to create a new architectural expression. Train stations became temples of mobility. The halls of Paris, Berlin, or Antwerp combined technology with monumentality. Glass roofs, iron columns, and wide arches created spaces that were both functional and impressive. Architecture became a symbol of speed, progress, and networking. Factories and warehouses also reflected the spirit of the time. Their design was primarily functional, but it was increasingly recognized that industrial buildings could also have an aesthetic effect. Uniform rows of windows, modular structures, and the repetition of elements created a visual order that symbolized the rationalism and efficiency of the industry. Residential architecture also changed. With urbanization, tenements emerged in the growing cities, often monotonous and densely built, but functional. At the same time, architects such as Otto Wagner in Vienna or Peter Behrens in Germany developed new approaches to combine aesthetics and functionality. Her works marked the transition to a modern, rational way of building. The industrial age also opened up the possibility of tall buildings. The first high-rise buildings were erected with steel girders, especially in the USA. The skyscrapers in Chicago and New York were not only functional, but also symbols of a new urban power and technological superiority. This epoch shows that architecture was no longer just symbolism, monumentality, or tradition. It became technical architecture, a combination of engineering, material innovation, and social function. Iron, steel, and glass changed the aesthetics of the city, opened up spaces for light and air, and made possible buildings that would have been unthinkable until then. The architecture of the industrial age is thus the forerunner of modernism. It combines function, material, and technology in a way that looks to the future. It shows the power of human innovation and the transformation of cities, landscapes, and living spaces. Chapter 15. Modernist Architecture: Functionality, Minimalism, and New Materials. At the beginning of the 20th century, architecture entered an era that radically redefined the foundations of building: modernism. It was characterized by a clear orientation towards function, minimalism, and the consistent use of new materials such as steel, concrete, and glass. Modernism no longer sought the ornamental beauty of the past, but the logical, clear form as an expression of practicality, rationality, and progress. The industrial cities and technological progress had shown that traditional architectural styles were often unsuitable for the needs of the modern world. Urban planning, housing construction, and public infrastructure demand efficiency, light, air, and standardization. This is exactly where modernism came in. Architecture was reduced to its function. Everything superfluous was removed. The principle of form follows function shaped the design. A milestone was the work of Le Corbusier, who revolutionized architecture with concepts such as the living machine and the use of reinforced concrete. His Villa Savoie in Poissy near Paris is a prime example. Raised on supports, with free floor plans, flat roofs, and large glass fronts, it shows how rational design and aesthetics can merge. Light, space, and movement become architectural elements in their own right. In Germany, the architects of the Bauhaus developed similar ideas. Walter Gropius, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and Hannes Meyer were looking for a style that combined art, craftsmanship, and industry. Functionality and minimalism dominated: clear lines, right angles, geometric shapes. Glass, steel, and concrete were used not only because they were modern, but also because they enabled the basic idea of reduction and practicality. Modernism also led to the emergence of the high-rise as an urban form. In the USA, especially in Chicago and New York, skyscrapers became symbols of economic power and technological achievement. The Empire State Building, the Rockefeller Center, and the Chrysler Building show how architecture can become an expression of progress, prestige, and urban dynamism. Another characteristic of modernity is the social claim. Housing, schools, hospitals, and public facilities should serve all people. Modern architecture strove to increase the quality of life. Light, air, space, and hygiene were important criteria. The housing estates in Weissenhof in Stuttgart or the Werkbund estates in Germany show how social responsibility and modern design language can come together. The aesthetic reduction is also characteristic. Decor is considered superfluous. Beauty comes from proportion, material, and clear lines. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe summed this up with his famous phrase, "Less is more." The architectural form becomes an expression of logic and function, not ornamentation. Modernism is not only national but international. The new style spread from Europe to the USA to Japan, influencing urban planning, office buildings, residential architecture, and public buildings. International style and functionalist architecture still shape the image of modern cities today. Modernism shows that architecture is no longer just a monument, symbol, or decoration. It is a tool, an expression of technology and rationality. It creates living spaces that meet people's needs. It shows that the building process itself is part of the idea. Every material, every line, and every space is an expression of a clear vision. Modernism lays the foundation for all subsequent developments in the 20th and 21st centuries, from postmodernism to contemporary architecture, from high-tech buildings to sustainable, digitally designed cities.
Chapter 16: Postmodern Architecture, Diversity, Irony, and Historical Quotations. The 1970s and 1980s marked the beginning of postmodernism, a reaction to the austerity and rationality of modernism. While modernism reduced architecture to function, minimalism, and rationality, postmodernism celebrated diversity, play, and reference to history. Buildings became narrative, ironic, and expressive again, a style that understood architecture as a cultural and aesthetic medium. Postmodernism turned against the supposed coldness of functionalism. Buildings were once again allowed to show decor, symbols, and colors. They were allowed to play, surprise, tell stories. Historical forms were no longer just copied, but quoted, combined, and alienated. This resulted in facades that integrated Renaissance, Baroque, Classicism, or Gothic in a humorous, modern way. A famous example is the Piazza d'Italia in New Orleans, designed by Charles Moore. The buildings combine classical columns, colorful domes, and playful ornaments without claiming historical accuracy. They create a poetic, ironic, and at the same time functional cityscape that amazes and makes the audience smile. Postmodernism also became visible in the high-rise buildings. The Portland Building by Michael Graves combines geometric shapes, colors, and decorative elements that are deliberately exaggerated and symbolic. Instead of a simple glass facade as in modernism, history is told, criticism is exercised, and architecture is staged. Another characteristic of postmodernism is plurality. There is no uniform style, no binding rules. Designers and architects combine forms freely, play with scale, material, and function. The reference to pop culture, advertising, and local traditions also becomes visible. Architecture is becoming interdisciplinary. It appeals not only to the intellect, but also to the senses, emotions, and imagination. In postmodernism, urban planning also plays a new role. Historic city centers have been preserved, but at the same time, new structures have emerged that create dialogues between old and new, tradition and innovation. The cities themselves become lively, diverse stages in which architecture conveys not only function, but also identity. Postmodernism is critical at the same time. It questions modernity, ironizes its dogmas, and opens up new perspectives. Architecture becomes a means of reflection on history, culture, society, and aesthetics. Today, postmodernism is the basis for the diversity of contemporary architecture. Their idea that buildings tell stories, that shapes play, and that the quotation from history can be part of the design shapes architects worldwide. It shows that architecture is more than function or technology. It is a cultural medium, an expression of identity and creativity.
Chapter 17: High-Tech Architecture and Minimalism, Technology as Expression. With the transition to the late 20th century, architecture entered a new phase that was strongly influenced by technology, material innovation, and functional aesthetics: high-tech architecture. It was created as a further development of modernism, but at the same time as a deliberate staging of technical possibilities. At the same time, a minimalism developed that celebrated the reduction to the essentials and reduced the architectural form to material, structure, and space. The high-tech architecture reveals its technical elements. Supporting structures, pipelines, elevators, and ventilation systems are made visible and become architectural design elements. Buildings are thus not only shells, but an expression of their function. They seem like machines for people, in which technology and aesthetics merge. An outstanding representative of this movement is Richard Rogers, whose Lloyd's building in London relocates the pipes, stairs, and elevators to the outside so that they remain visible. At the same time, it creates flexible interiors that can be used for different functions. Similarly, with the HSBC building in Hong Kong, Norman Foster shows that high-tech architecture is an overall concept. Light, space, and technology are combined to achieve maximum efficiency and visual impact. At the same time, minimalism developed as a counter-movement to ornamentation and decorative gimmicks. The rule here is less is more. Material, space, and light form the architecture. Clear lines, right angles, smooth surfaces, and neutral colors dominate. Famous representatives such as Tadao Ando or John Pawson create spaces that are impressive due to reduction, lighting, and the effect of materials. Minimalist architecture does not speak through decor, but through experience and perception. A central feature of the high-tech and minimal architecture is the integration of material and function. Steel, glass, concrete, and modern composites allow new spans, transparent facades, and open floor plans. Technology becomes visible. Form arises from function. Architecture is no longer a cladding, but an expression of the logic of the building. These principles are also evident in urban planning. Office buildings, universities, or museums are clearly structured, functionally oriented, but at the same time become urban signs. The Centre Pompidou in Paris, designed by Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers, is a prime example. The entire technical system, stairs, ventilation, pipes, becomes part of the facade design and the visual identity of the building. High-tech and minimal architecture show a new attitude. They dispense with decor, staging, or historical quotations in order to make the technology, structure, and function visible. Buildings become manifestos of a rational, modern society that seeks to reconcile aesthetics, efficiency, and material. These currents thus mark the architecture of the information age, in which technology, globalization, and rationality shape cities. They set standards for office buildings, airports, shopping malls, universities, and residential complexes worldwide, and prepare the ground for the flexible, digital architecture of the 21st century.
Chapter 18: Sustainable Architecture and Ecological Concepts, Building for the Future. With the beginning of the 21st century, architecture has been increasingly shaped by a new awareness, sustainability, and ecological responsibility. In view of global challenges such as climate change, scarcity of resources, and urbanization, the question of how buildings can be designed to be environmentally friendly, energy efficient, and future-proof came to the fore. Architecture thus became not only an expression of power, aesthetics, or technology, but also an instrument for ecological action. A central principle is the use of energy. Buildings should be planned in such a way that they have minimal energy consumption, whether through thermal insulation, modern heating and cooling systems, or through the use of renewable energies such as solar, wind, or geothermal energy. Passive houses and energy-efficient office buildings show how technology and design can go hand in hand. Another feature is the choice of materials. Sustainable architecture is increasingly relying on renewable, recyclable, or local materials. Wood, clay, recycled concrete, or innovative composites are increasingly replacing energy-intensive building materials, such as conventional concrete or steel. Not only is the environmental impact reduced, but aesthetic potential is also exploited. Wooden facades, green roofs, or lively interiors create a connection between nature and architecture. The integration of green spaces is another central element. Green roofs, vertical gardens, or courtyards increase the quality of life, improve the microclimate, and contribute to air purification. Buildings become ecological systems that take into account not only people, but also flora and fauna. Urban planning is also permeated by sustainable principles. New districts focus on pedestrian friendliness, cycle paths, and public transport, reduce land sealing, and promote urban biodiversity. The city becomes a living organism in which architecture, nature, and infrastructure are in harmony. An outstanding example of sustainable architecture is the Bosco Verticale in Milan. The high-rises are not just living spaces, but living vertical forests. Thousands of trees and plants improve air quality, provide habitat for birds and insects, and create a pleasant microclimate. Architecture, nature, and technology merge here to form a model of the future. The concept of smart buildings also characterizes sustainable architecture. Sensors, digital control systems, and intelligent networks optimize energy consumption, light guidance, ventilation, and indoor climate. Buildings are dynamically controlled, adapting to users, environmental conditions, and seasons. The architecture thus becomes a living, adaptive system. Sustainable architecture is not only technical and ecological, but also social. It creates spaces for community, promotes healthy living conditions, and takes into account the needs of all users. Architecture becomes a responsibility here. It not only designs buildings, but also living spaces for an entire society. This trend shows that architecture must be an answer to the challenges of the time more than ever. It combines technology, design, aesthetics, and responsibility. It is an expression of man's ability to consciously shape his environment, conserve resources, and make the cities and landscapes of the future worth living in. Sustainable architecture is therefore a key to the coming decades. It combines tradition, technology, innovation, and nature to create a concept that meets the challenges of the 21st century.
Chapter 19: Digital Architecture and Parametric Design. Algorithms as a design tool. With the advent of digital technologies, 21st century architecture began a new phase: digital architecture and parametric design. Computers, algorithms, and software make it possible to develop forms and structures that were previously unthinkable. Architecture is not only built, but also calculated, simulated, and optimized, a symbiosis of technology, art, and science. Parametric design is based on variable parameters that are related to each other. A design is no longer a static object, but a system that can flexibly adapt to conditions. Factors such as wind load, solar radiation, material behavior, or load-bearing capacity are incorporated into the form-finding process in real time. This results in buildings whose aesthetics and function result from a large number of calculations and simulations. An example of this is the Heydar Aliyev Center in Baku, designed by Zaha Hadid. The flowing curves that glide organically across the floor are only possible through computer-aided planning. Every line, every surface follows mathematical rules that are aesthetic and functional at the same time. The architecture thus becomes an expression of dynamism, movement, and technology. Digital tools also play a decisive role in high-rise construction. Complex facades, adaptive sun protection systems, or wind-optimized structures can only be efficiently realized through parameterized design processes. Buildings such as One Central Park in Sydney or the Aqua Tower in Chicago show how parametric design combines natural influences, material efficiency, and aesthetic form. Digital architecture also enables simulations of environmental conditions. Light curves, thermal load, or acoustics can be calculated before construction. This results in sustainable, resource-saving buildings that are precisely tailored to the location, use, and climatic conditions. Technology, ecology, and design merge into an integral process. Another field is robotics in architecture. 3D printing, robot-assisted production, and automated assembly allow new material applications and shapes. Organic structures, complex patterns, or individualized components can thus be realized, a step that expands the traditional craft technique but does not replace it. Digital architecture is also changing the relationship between designer and user. Users can influence parametric systems, adapt buildings to their needs, or control interactive elements. Architecture is becoming more flexible, adaptive, and participatory. Spaces adapt to people, not the other way around. This development marks a turning point. Architecture is no longer just a static object, but a dynamic system that calculates, simulates, and behaves in a controlled manner. It shows how closely technology, aesthetics, and sustainability are linked today and opens up new possibilities for the cities, landscapes, and living spaces of the future. Digital architecture is thus an example of how the history of architecture, from the first mud huts to parametric skyscrapers, is a continuous process of innovation, experimentation, and adaptation. Technology, design, and human creativity merge to create a new understanding of architecture in the digital age. Chapter 20. Outlook: Architecture in the 21st Century and the Future of Cities. With the beginning of the 21st century, architecture is in a phase characterized by diversity, technology, and global responsibility. The developments of recent decades, digital planning, parametric design, sustainable construction methods show that architecture is much more than form, material, or function. It is an expression of our culture, our values, and our ability to respond to societal and environmental challenges. Sustainability is a central issue. Cities are becoming denser, resources are becoming scarcer, climate changes are noticeable. Architects and planners are looking for solutions that combine energy efficiency, resource conservation, and human quality of life. Green roofs, vertical gardens, renewable energy supply, and adaptive buildings are no longer dreams of the future, but reality in many urban projects worldwide. The architecture of the 21st century is therefore also an architecture of responsibility. Technological innovations are changing the way we build ground-ligand. 3D printing, robotics, modular systems, and digital manufacturing make it possible to efficiently implement individual, flexible, and complex buildings. Parametric design allows form, function, and environmental conditions to converge in one system. Buildings become dynamic. They react to their surroundings, adapt to climate, light, or use, and thus become intelligent structures. The cities themselves are at the heart of these developments. Urbanization, mobility, and social change require new concepts for living spaces, infrastructure, and community. Concepts such as smart cities integrate digital control, data analysis, and intelligent transport systems to make cities more livable, efficient, and sustainable. Here, architecture is not just a building, but a part of a complex urban system. Another trend is the integration of nature and architecture. Buildings and green spaces merge. Urban agriculture, parks, and biotopes become part of urban planning. Cities are becoming ecological networks that bring people, nature, and technology into harmony. This fusion of nature and building shows that architecture is becoming increasingly multidimensional. It serves not only people, but the entire ecological system. At the same time, the aesthetic dimension remains central. Architecture must fascinate, create spaces that trigger emotions, create identity, and make culture visible. Whether futuristic museum buildings, parameterized high-rise buildings, or sustainable residential quarters, the architecture of the 21st century combines technology, function, and design in an unprecedented way. The future of architecture will also be shaped by social and political factors. Housing, community, social inclusion, and cultural diversity will increasingly come into focus. Architecture is no longer just elite art, but a tool to design cities for all people. In summary, the history of architecture shows that it is a mirror of humanity. It tells of the need for protection, faith, power, aesthetics, innovation, and responsibility. From the simple mud house of the early days to the pyramids, temples, cathedrals, palaces, skyscrapers, to digital and sustainable buildings, architecture documents the development of people, their societies, and their technologies. The architecture of the 21st century is thus at a crossroads. It combines tradition, technology, sustainability, and creativity. It responds to global challenges, uses digital tools, integrates nature, and creates habitats for a growing and diverse population. It shows that architecture is always more than function or form. It is a design principle for the future, a medium that has a lasting impact on our cities, our society, and our culture.